The rain in Pittsburgh that February did not fall so much as hang in the air, fine and gray and endless, the kind that soaked through a wool coat in under a block and left a person standing in line outside a storage auction warehouse, feeling like something already half dissolved. Catherine Wren stood in that line with a numbered ticket in her hand, ticket 41, and a coat that had cost more than the rent she could no longer make, and she watched a man 2 spots ahead of her crack his knuckles like he was warming up for something. She had built a company from a card table in her father's garage to $40 million in annual revenue. 3 weeks ago, she had signed her name off the front door of it for the last time. Tonight, she was here to sell the only thing she had left, a dented gray steel safe nobody in this room would bid more than $50 for. And what she did not know, what nobody in that fluorescent-lit warehouse could have told her, was that the man who would buy it that night would crack it open before sunrise and find the one thing the bankruptcy lawyers never knew existed. If a story like that already has its hooks in you, hit the like button right now and tell me down in the comments what you would do with the locked box nobody else wanted. Now let's begin. She had gotten the storage facility's liquidation notice on a Monday, a single sheet of paper taped to the unit door in the particular bureaucratic font that makes the end of a life look exactly like the end of any other overdue invoice, and she had spent that week doing the math on what was actually worth saving. A calculation she had never once in her life expected to make about her own. Father's tools. The desk went first, listed by the facility itself before she could intervene, sold to a reseller for $80 over the phone without her ever seeing a face attached to the transaction. The filing cabinets went the same way. By Thursday, there was almost nothing left in the unit that anyone considered worth the trouble of a private sale, only the safe. Too heavy and too locked to move easily, the kind of object that exists in storage facilities purely as a problem someone else eventually has to solve. And the facility manager had told her, not unkindly, that her best option was simply to let it go through the public auction with everything else, rather than pay the hauling fee to keep it. She had stood outside the unit that Thursday afternoon with her hand flat against the cold steel door for longer than she meant to. The particular goodbye you give an object when you cannot afford to give it anything else, and then she had driven to the warehouse that evening because some stubborn, exhausted part of her needed to see where it went, rather than simply receive a confirmation email. The auction house occupied a converted distribution warehouse off Route 51, the kind of building with skylights that had gone opaque, with 2 decades of grime and a concrete floor that held the cold the way a basement holds it, deep and patient. Units went up for bid in the order they'd been abandoned, cheapest junk first, working toward whatever the auctioneer judged worth saving for an audience that had mostly stopped paying attention. Unit 114 came up at 8:40 on a Thursday night, 11 lots in, called out in the flat, efficient cadence of a man who had said 10,000 of these sentences before and would say 10,000 more. Storage contents, office furniture, personal effects, no manufacturer information available on the safe, sold as is, opening bid $50. Nobody moved for it. A safe with no maker's mark and a deadbolt mechanism nobody could identify was a liability, not a find. It meant hauling 400 pounds of dead steel out of a warehouse on the chance there was something inside worth the trouble. And most of the regulars in that room had been burned on exactly that bet before. Caleb Hartley was not most of the regulars. He came to these auctions on Thursday nights the way other men went to the gym, a habit built into the architecture of his week, because Junie's bedtime routine ended at 7:45, and his mother-in-law could watch her until 10 without complaint. And because a man who repaired and serviced safes for a living could not afford to pass up a unit that nobody else wanted to touch. He raised his paddle at $50 because nobody raised it back. Sold, the auctioneer said, lot 114, to bidder 12. Catherine watched him do it from 4 people back in the crowd of people not bidding, and something in her chest did a thing she did not have a polite word for. The safe had belonged to her father. It had sat in the corner of his workshop for 30 years, bolted to the concrete slab, holding nothing more dramatic than tax records and a coffee can of loose change for most of that time, until the bankruptcy trustee's inventory team swept through what remained of her storage unit and listed it as company chattel without asking her a single question about where it had actually come from. She had tried to explain. She had tried in the gray, exhausted weeks after the company collapsed to tell anyone who would listen that the safe was her father's, personal property, not corporate property, that it had nothing to do with the funding fraud that had taken everything else from her. Nobody had listened, because by then nobody listened to Catherine Wren about anything. She watched a stranger in a canvas work jacket sign a slip of paper and wheel her father's safe toward a hand truck, and she did not say a single word, because there was nothing left to say that would change the outcome, and because she had learned, in 3 brutal weeks, exactly how much her objections were worth in a room full of people settling debts. She had been 29 years old when she founded the company, a fact that the press had loved to repeat in the early years, the way you love repeating any detail that makes a story sound more like a miracle than the long, unglamorous grind it had actually been. Her father, Thomas Wren, had been a tool and die man his whole working life. The kind of precision machinist who could hold a tolerance of 0.02 of an inch by feel before he'd even checked the gauge. And he had spent the last 11 years of that life managing diabetes on insulin doses he measured by guesswork, because the equipment that would have made it safe and exact cost more than he made in 3 months. He died on a Tuesday morning at 61, a hypoglycemic episode that should not have killed a healthy man, and did kill a tired one, alone in his workshop with a dosage error nobody would ever be able to undo. Catherine had been 26. She had spent the next 3 years of her life with that morning living somewhere behind her sternum, a low constant ache she had eventually converted. The way grief sometimes converts, if a person is stubborn and angry enough, into the foundational engineering problem of her adult life. How do you make an exact, error-proof insulin microdose for the millions of people priced out of the equipment that could have saved her father? She built it. That was the part the press loved most. The actual answer. The device itself. A portable microdosing pump that cost a fraction of the market leader and made dosing errors close to mechanically impossible. By 33, she had 140 employees and a manufacturing partner in Ohio, and a board that told her, with increasing frequency, that an acquisition offer from one of the major device companies would set her up for the rest of her life if she would only consider it. She had not considered it. She had told them more than once. With the particular flat certainty she used for things she had decided years before anyone asked her opinion, that the company existed to keep the price of that device low, and an acquisition from a company that made its margins on the expensive alternative would mean the device disappearing inside a portfolio, slow-walked or quietly discontinued, and she had not built it to disappear. What she had not built, what she had not seen, was the man running her finance department. Desmond Pierce had come on as chief financial officer in year 4, recommended by 2 board members who'd worked with him before, and described him in the language people use for someone they trust, without quite being able to say why. He was good at his job in the specific way that made Catherine grateful she didn't have to think about the parts of running a company she found tedious. He handled the manufacturing partner contracts, the supply chain financing, the lines of credit that kept the company solvent through 3 lean quarters in year 5, when a competitor undercut their pricing in 2 key markets. He was, in the language the bankruptcy filings would later use, the architect of a financing structure that had been quietly insolvent for 2 years, before anyone outside his department understood the scale of it. A structure built on supply chain loans collateralized against receivables that did not exist in the volume the paperwork claimed. And when the manufacturing partner finally called a covenant default on a Tuesday morning in October, the entire structure came down in 9 days. Catherine had signed things in those 9 days. She had signed a great many things. Documents her own legal team had assured her were standard emergency financing instruments. Documents she had read with the specific, desperate skimming attention of someone trying to save 140 jobs, and a device that mattered more to her than her own name on the door. And some of those documents had contained representations about the company's financial position that were not true. Representations Desmond Pierce had drafted, and her own signature now sat beneath. The bankruptcy trustee's filing did not call it fraud, not in the document that named her specifically. It called it a pattern of representations requiring further review, language with the particular bloodless menace of something that could become an indictment if the wrong person decided to push it. And Desmond Pierce, who had structured a separate holding entity months before the collapse. Walked out of the company's liquidation with the patent portfolio and a clean signature and the specific, careful sympathy of a man who tells everyone how terrible this all is for poor Catherine. The patent portfolio included the device. It included, technically, everything filed in the company's name during her tenure as founder and chief executive. Every refinement and improvement she had personally engineered into the original concept, every page of intellectual property that the bankruptcy court had transferred, and the cleanest and most legally unimpeachable transaction Desmond Pierce had ever structured, to a holding company he controlled through 2 layers of paperwork that took Catherine's own attorney 4 days to fully untangle. She had nothing left after that. Not the company, not the device, not the apartment she could no longer afford once the consulting income she'd been promised during the transition evaporated, along with everything else Desmond Pierce had promised her, in the soft, careful voice he used for difficult conversations. She had a storage unit in Penn Hills, with the last physical contents of a life she'd built, and on a Thursday night in February, she had $300 in a checking account, and a notice that the storage facility was liquidating the unit for unpaid fees, and she had come to watch strangers buy the remains of her father's workshop for the price of a tank of gas, because there had been nobody left to send in her place. The man with the canvas jacket wheeled the safe toward the loading dock. Catherine watched the door close behind him and felt the specific kind of cold that has nothing to do with February. Caleb Hartley had not planned to feel anything about Lot 114 beyond the mild professional satisfaction of a goodbye. He ran a locksmith shop on Butler Street that he'd inherited, in the loosest possible sense of the word inherit, from a man named Sal, who had trained him as an 18-year-old apprentice and then sold him the business at a price that amounted to a long, patient act of generosity disguised as a business transaction. Caleb had been a machinist before that. 3 years in a precision tooling shop in Homestead, learning to read tolerances and hold a steady hand under a loop, the kind of training that turned out to translate almost without effort into the particular discipline of opening locks that did not want to be opened. He had Junie now, 7 years old, sharp-eyed and unstoppable, and a mortgage on a small house in Lawrenceville that he made every month by a margin thinner than he liked to think about, and a habit of buying unidentified safes at Thursday night auctions because the parts alone, scrap steel and salvageable internals, were usually worth more than the $50 or $75 he'd typically pay. He'd bid on Lot 114 because nobody else had, and because the safe's age and the particular pattern of wear on its handle told him it predated the manufacturing codes printed on newer models, which meant it might be worth opening properly rather than just cutting for parts. He loaded it into the bed of his truck with the hand truck the auction house lent out for exactly this purpose. And he did not notice the woman standing near the door watching him do it, did not register her at all, because there was nothing about a stranger in a wet coat that would have told him anything about what he was carrying. The drive home took 18 minutes. Junie was asleep by the time he got there, his mother-in-law Marion dozing on the couch with the television, playing something she wasn't watching, and Caleb backed the truck into the driveway and decided the safe could wait until morning. A decision he reversed 40 minutes later when he found himself standing in the garage in his socks, a headlamp on, running his fingers along the dial's worn brass face out of the specific compulsion that had made him good at this work in the first place. There was something underneath the rust and the deadbolt mechanism that interested him in a way he could not yet name. He worked for 2 hours before Marion called down that she was heading home, and he told her not to wait up. And he kept working, because that was the whole of what he did. The only part of the job that had never once felt like work to him. Some problems you solved because someone paid you to. Some problems you solved because the not knowing sat in your chest like a held breath, and you could not put it down until you'd let it out. He did not crack the safe that night. It would take him 3 weeks. Evenings stacked on evenings after Junie was asleep. 3 weeks during which he had no idea that the woman who had watched him drive away with it was sleeping. By the second week, in a Motel 6 off the Parkway East, with everything she owned in 2 suitcases, working 4 shifts a week at a coffee shop that did not know her name had once appeared in a magazine. Feature about women changing the face of medical technology. 3 weeks during which neither of them knew the other existed in any way that mattered. The two halves of a story that had not yet started, sitting 15 miles apart in a city that did not know it was about to matter to either of them at all. Caleb had inherited the rhythm of his evenings from a man named Sal Mancuso, who had run the locksmith shop on Butler Street for 31 years before deciding, at 73, that his hands had earned the right to stop, and who had trained Caleb at 18 with the specific patient cruelty of a master craftsman who refused to let a student get away with shortcuts. Sal had not believed in teaching the easy way. He had made Caleb pick the same 3 locks for 6 straight weeks before he was permitted to touch a single safe, had made him learn the internal geometry of a tumbler the way some men learn scripture, by repetition until it stopped being information and became instinct. When Sal finally sold him the shop, the price on paper had been nominal, a fraction of what the lease and equipment were actually worth, and Caleb had spent years understanding that the real price had been those 6 weeks. The demand that he respect the work enough to never rush it, a lesson that had outlived Sal himself by nearly a decade, and shaped, more than Caleb usually admitted out loud, the way he approached almost everything else in his life, including grief, including fatherhood, including a stranger's dented safe with no manufacturer's mark. Elise had died on a Wednesday in March, 3 years before the storage auction, a brain aneurysm with no symptoms anyone could have caught in time, the kind of death that left no equipment to blame and no decision to second-guess, only the specific brutal randomness of a body failing without warning. Caleb had been at the shop. He had gotten the call from a coworker at Elise's office, had driven to the hospital not yet understanding the words being said to him, and had walked out 4 hours later into a parking lot that looked exactly the same as it had that morning, which struck him, in the disordered logic of early grief, as somehow the cruelest detail of the entire day. Junie had been 4. She did not remember her mother in continuous scenes the way Caleb did, only in fragments, the smell of a particular shampoo, the sound of a laugh she could not fully reconstruct, and Caleb had spent 3 years trying to hold both jobs at once. Father and the only living repository of a person his daughter was slowly forgetting. A weight he had learned to carry the way Sal had taught him to hold a tension wrench, steady, unhurried, never letting the strain show in his hands even when it was the only thing he could feel. He had built his evenings into a structure, because structure was the only thing that had gotten him through the first year. Junie's bedtime routine ended at 7:45. 2 books and a song about a fox that she had outgrown wanting, but still requested out of what Caleb suspected was simple loyalty to the ritual itself. Marion arrived most evenings around 6 to help with dinner and stayed through bedtime, a kindness she had offered without being asked in the worst weeks after Elise died and had simply never stopped offering. And Caleb had come to depend on her presence in a way he rarely said out loud, the quiet, reliable backbone of a household that would have buckled without her. The Thursday auctions had started as a way to keep the shop's parts inventory stocked cheaply, but they had become, somewhere in the second year, something closer to the only hour of the week that was entirely his own. No client waiting. No daughter needing, just the particular absorbed concentration of evaluating a lock he had never seen before and deciding whether it was worth the gamble. The 3 weeks between bringing the safe home and finally opening it were not 3 weeks of steady progress. They were 3 weeks of the particular stop-and-start failure that defined most of Caleb's real work, the kind nobody saw. Evenings spent listening through a stethoscope pressed against cold steel for the faint click of wheels falling into place. Evenings that ended with nothing, a dial that gave him no information at all, a mechanism old enough that its internal geometry did not match anything in his reference books. He tried manipulation first, the slow patient art of feeling for the gates by hand, and got nowhere for 8 straight nights, the specific frustration of a man whose hands had never failed him quite this completely before. He switched to drilling out the spindle on the 9th night and stopped himself halfway through, because something about the weight of the thing, the careful way it had been bolted to a workshop floor for 30 years, told him drilling would feel like vandalism rather than work, and he was not willing to do that to a stranger's safe, no matter how badly he wanted to know what was inside it. He went back to manipulation. He spent an evening with Frank Dolinsky's old contact at a regional locksmith association, a retired tradesman who remembered, after some prompting, that safes of this exact pattern had been custom built by a small Pittsburgh fabricator in the 1970s for tool and die shops that wanted something more secure than a standard filing cabinet but couldn't afford a commercial vault. And the detail narrowed his search enough that he finally found a mechanism diagram in an old trade catalog Sal had kept in a box in the shop's back room for reasons neither of them had ever needed to articulate. He read the diagram twice under the work lamp, recalibrated his approach, and on the third week, just past 11 on a Tuesday, felt the dial give. The safe gave up its secret on a Tuesday, just past 11 at night, the third week of working it, and Caleb felt the dial give with the specific small click that every locksmith learns to recognize the way a sailor learns to recognize the change in wind before a storm. He sat back on his heels in the garage and did not open it right away. He had learned, over years of doing this work, that the seconds right before a lock surrenders were worth respecting, and he let himself have 10 of them, 10 seconds of not knowing, before he pulled the handle down and the heavy door swung open on hinges that had not moved in longer than he could guess. There was no cash inside. No jewelry, no deed, nothing that explained why someone had bothered to bolt 400 pounds of steel to a workshop floor. There was a leather notebook, soft with age and handling, its cover cracked along the spine where it had been opened thousands of times. There was a small velvet pouch that turned out to hold a tarnished metal, the kind given out at regional engineering competitions decades ago, the name on the back worn nearly illegible. And there was a photograph, black and white gone gray with time. A man in his 30s standing in a workshop with his arm around a girl who could not have been older than 9, both of them laughing at something outside the frame. The kind of photograph that makes you feel like an intruder for looking at it. Caleb opened the notebook under the work lamp and found pages of hand-drawn mechanical schematics, dense and precise, dimensions noted in a draftsman's careful hand, dated in the corner of each page going back further than he could account for. He was not an engineer, not anymore, but 3 years in a precision tooling shop had taught him to read a technical drawing, and what he was looking at, even without understanding the application, was clearly the work of someone who had spent a career inside tolerances most people never thought about. He turned pages for 40 minutes before he found, near the back, a name. Thomas Wren, written in the same careful hand as the dimensions, dated on a page that described, in painstaking detail, a microdosing valve mechanism Caleb did not have the vocabulary to identify, but recognized, on some level he could not fully explain, as the kind of thing somebody somewhere had probably spent a career trying to invent. He did not sell the parts. He had told himself, walking into the auction 3 weeks earlier, that whatever this safe held would be his by the rules of a fair transaction. $50 and a winning paddle, no different from any other lot he'd ever bought. He sat in his garage at midnight with a dead man's notebook open on his workbench and found that the rule did not survive contact with the photograph. The girl laughing in a workshop that no longer existed, the metal worn smooth from being handled by someone who must have carried it in a pocket more than once. He could not have said exactly why. He only knew that some things you found were not, in any way that mattered, actually yours, even when the paperwork said otherwise, and that he had learned this lesson the hard way once before. 3 years ago, in a hospital corridor where a doctor had told him things about Elise's brain that no amount of paperwork or insurance authorization had been able to undo, and he had walked out of that hospital understanding, in his bones, that some losses do not care what anyone signed. He searched the name the next morning before opening the shop. Between making Junie's lunch and walking her to the bus stop, typing Thomas Wren microdosing patent into a search bar on his phone with the specific clumsy persistence of a man who was not used to research and would not let that stop him. It took him most of the week, evenings spent following one thread to the next, before he found the article. A regional business journal piece from 18 months earlier, a profile of a founder named Catherine Wren, daughter of a tool and die machinist, building an affordable insulin device named for the principle her father had spent his career perfecting. The photograph in the article was a professional headshot, polished and confident. Nothing like the exhausted woman who had stood near the warehouse door 3 weeks before, but Caleb recognized the surname before he recognized anything else, and the recognition landed in his chest like a held breath finally released. He showed the notebook to a man named Frank Dolinsky first, a retired patent examiner who came into the shop every few months to get a battered fireproof box rekeyed, and who Caleb had always pegged, correctly as it turned out, as someone who knew far more than he ever volunteered. Frank flipped through 3 pages, went quiet in a way Caleb had learned to recognize meant something had actually registered, and said, without looking up, "This is a man who understood fluid dosing mechanics before most of the industry did. Whoever holds the rights to whatever this turned into owes this notebook a great deal more credit than a notebook usually gets." Caleb had not yet told him about the company, about Catherine Wren, about any of it. He had simply wanted to know whether he was looking at something that mattered or something that only looked like it did. And Frank's answer, offered freely and without being asked twice, had been the thing that turned a quiet hunch into a decision he could not talk himself out of. He found her through the kind of patient, unglamorous legwork that came naturally to a man who spent his days reading the small details other people missed. The Business Journal article mentioned the bankruptcy filing in an update appended 6 weeks later. The bankruptcy filing, public record once he knew where to look, listed a forwarding address that turned out to be a Motel 6 off the Parkway East. He drove there on a Thursday after closing the shop, the notebook wrapped in a clean towel on the passenger seat like something fragile, and he sat in the parking lot for 11 minutes before he made himself get out of the truck. Because showing up at a stranger's motel room uninvited was not a thing he had ever done in his life. And he was not entirely sure how to do it without sounding like exactly the kind of person who shows up at strangers' motel rooms uninvited. She opened the door 3 inches on the chain, and he watched her face do the thing faces do when they are deciding, in real time, whether the person in front of them is a threat. And he understood that looked better than most people would have, because he had spent 3 years learning to read it on his own daughter's face after every loss large enough to make her flinch at the next one. "I bought a safe at an auction 3 weeks ago," he said. "Storage unit 114. I think it was your father's." She did not say anything for a long moment. Then she said, through the 3-inch gap, "What do you want?" "Nothing," he said. "I wanted to give you what was inside it." The chain came off slower than he expected, and she stood in the doorway in a coffee shop uniform that still had the smell of an evening shift on it, and she looked at the towel-wrapped bundle in his hands like it might be a trick. The specific tired suspicion of someone who had spent the last month learning that almost everyone who approached her wanted something. And Caleb understood that look too, the way you understand a language you've had to speak yourself. "I'm not selling anything," he said. "I'm not asking for anything. I just didn't think it was mine to keep." She took the bundle from him with both hands, the careful way you hold something you are bracing yourself to find painful, and she unwrapped it on the small round table inside the door. And Caleb watched her open the notebook to the first page and go very still in a way that told him everything he needed to know about what this object meant to her, more than any explanation could have. She turned the pages slowly. She found the photograph and pressed her palm flat against it for a moment, not crying exactly. Something closer to the held stillness of someone absorbing a blow they'd been braced for, and finding it landed differently than expected. "This is my father's handwriting," she said finally. Her voice had the flat, careful quality of someone working hard to keep it level. "I haven't seen this notebook in 15 years. I thought it was destroyed when his workshop closed." "It was in the safe," Caleb said. "Bolted to the floor. I almost cut it for parts." She looked up at him then, really looked. The kind of look that takes someone's measure in a single pass, and whatever she found there made something in her shoulders ease by a degree he doubted she was aware of. "Why didn't you?" she asked. "I don't know exactly," he said, and it was the truth, the most honest answer he had. "I just couldn't." She did not invite him in. She thanked him, formally, the careful gratitude of someone who had not had much practice receiving things without strings attached, and did not entirely trust this one to be different. And Caleb told her his shop's address in case she needed anything else. And he drove home with the specific, unsettled feeling of a man who has just done something right and does not yet understand why it cost him something to do it. There was a Saturday, in the 3rd week of those visits, when Junie, bored of her coloring book and unsupervised for the length of one customer transaction, climbed onto the stool nearest the register and asked Catherine, with no preamble at all, whether she used to be famous. Catherine had laughed before she could stop herself, the first real laugh she could remember producing in months, and told her that for about 4 years she had been a little bit famous. The kind of famous where strangers at conferences knew her name and nobody on her actual street did. And Junie had considered this with great seriousness and announced that she would rather be famous for inventing something than for being pretty, because pretty wore off and inventing didn't. Catherine had thought about that sentence for the rest of the shift, turning it over the way she turned over very few things anyone said to her anymore, because it had landed somewhere her father would have appreciated more than almost anything else a 7-year-old had ever said in her presence. Caleb noticed, over those weeks, the particular way Catherine's hand steadied when Junie was nearby, the tremor she had developed in the worst months, easing into something closer to stillness whenever there was a child's question to answer or a milk steamer to demonstrate. And he filed the observation away without naming it. The way he filed away most things he was not yet ready to examine too closely. What he could not have known, standing in that motel doorway, was that Catherine Wren had spent the drive back to her room that night with the notebook open on her lap under the dome light of her car, turning to a single page near the middle that had stopped her cold the first time and stopped her again on the second pass. A schematic for a microdosing valve refinement dated 19 years before she had personally arrived at the identical fix during her company's 3rd year of development. A fix she had presented to her engineering team as her own breakthrough. The solution that had made the device viable at scale. She had built her life's work believing she had solved a problem her father never lived to see solved. The notebook told a different story, one she did not yet understand the legal weight of, one that would take her weeks to fully grasp the implications of, but she closed the notebook that night with her hands not quite steady, because some part of her had already understood. In the wordless way the body understands things before the mind catches up, that whatever was buried in those pages might be the only thing left in the world that was actually, unambiguously, hers. She did not call him for 9 days. She told herself it was because she had nothing to call about, no reason to impose further on a stranger who had already done more than anyone owed her. But the truth was simpler and harder to admit, which was that she had spent 3 years learning that people who showed up with no agenda eventually revealed one, and she was not ready to find out what his was. The call came because of a leak, the small ordinary kind, a pipe under the bathroom sink at the coffee shop where she worked the early shift, and the owner, a woman named Aisha, who had hired Catherine without asking a single question about her last job, mentioned in passing that she needed a locksmith to come look at the back door too while the plumber was out. The deadbolt had been sticking for months. Catherine, without entirely deciding to, gave her Caleb's name and number off a business card he'd tucked into the towel without comment. And 3 days later, she walked into the back room during her shift and found him on one knee in front of the door, a leather roll of picks and tools spread across the floor beside him, methodical and unhurried, in a way that reminded her, with an ache she had not expected, of watching her father work. "You didn't have to come yourself," she said. "I own the shop," he said. "I send myself the small jobs sometimes. Keeps me honest about what the work actually costs." She watched him work for longer than she needed to, longer than the job required her to stand there, and she told herself it was professional curiosity, and knew, somewhere underneath the telling, that it was not entirely that. He fixed the deadbolt in 20 minutes and refused payment. Said the shop covered house calls under $50 as a courtesy, which she suspected was not strictly true, and she did not argue it, because arguing it would have meant admitting she didn't have $50 to spare even if he'd asked. Junie started coming by the coffee shop on Saturdays not long after that, ostensibly because Caleb had errands on Butler Street, and the shop had good hot chocolate, though Catherine came to understand, over the following weeks, that the errands were frequently invented, and the hot chocolate was frequently an excuse, and that her own presence behind the counter had become, without anyone formally deciding it, a fixed point in a 7-year-old Saturday morning. Junie was sharp in the particular unguarded way of a child who had learned early that adults did not always tell the truth, and had decided, in response, to simply tell it herself at every opportunity. She asked Catherine why she didn't have her own house. She asked why her hands shook a little when she made the espresso, a tremor Catherine had developed sometime in the worst weeks and had not yet found the nerve to see a doctor about. She asked on the 3rd Saturday whether Catherine and her dad were friends, and Catherine had said yes, careful and noncommittal, and Junie had looked at her with the patient skepticism of someone who suspected there was a more interesting answer being withheld and intended to find it eventually. What Catherine did not yet know. Standing behind that counter on ordinary Saturday steaming milk for a man who asked nothing of her and a child who asked everything, was that the notebook sitting in a drawer in her motel room was about to become the most contested object in a fight she had not yet been told she was in. Desmond Pierce had heard, through the specific quiet channel that industry gossip always finds, that something had surfaced from Thomas Wren's old workshop, something with handwriting and dates on it that predated the company's founding by nearly 2 decades, and Desmond Pierce understood, faster and more precisely than Catherine did, exactly what that would mean if anyone with a law degree got a good look at it. He found her on a Tuesday, the way men like Desmond Pierce always found people, through a phone call that arrived sounding like concern, and worked. Underneath, like a deposition. He had a number for her, because he had always had a number for her. 3 years of board meetings and quarterly reviews leaving him with every contact detail she'd never thought to change, and he called the coffee shop directly. Asked for her by name in a voice Aisha described afterward as smooth, in a way that made her want to wash her hands. "Catherine," he said, when she picked up the phone in the back room, her stomach already dropping before he'd said anything that should have warranted it. "I heard you've had a rough few months. You have my number from the board distribution list," she said. "Take me off it. I'm calling as a friend," he said, and she had to set the phone down on the counter for a second and breathe before she picked it back up, because the word friend in his mouth had the particular weight of something engineered, the way every sentence Desmond Pierce had ever spoken to her was engineered, 3 moves ahead of whatever he appeared to be saying. "I heard something surfaced," he said. "Some old paperwork of your father's. I wanted to check in, make sure you weren't getting any bad advice about what it means." She did not ask how he knew. She understood, with the specific cold clarity that had become familiar to her over the past several months, that the not asking was itself information. That a man like Desmond Pierce had channels into the patent attorney community and the local engineering circles that meant nothing involving Thomas Wren's name stayed quiet for long, especially once Caleb had started. With his careful, methodical persistence, asking a contact at a local IP firm whether old hand-drawn schematics could establish prior art against a later filing. "What do you want, Desmond?" she said. "I want to help you," he said, and the worst part, the part that would keep her awake that night turning the conversation over in the dark, was that some thin sliver of her almost believed him. Because Desmond Pierce had spent 4 years cultivating exactly that believability. The patient, reasonable voice of a man who always seemed to be the only person in the room thinking clearly. "There's a real risk here, Catherine," he said. "If old documentation surfaces that complicates the IP transfer, the bankruptcy court could reopen the whole estate. Your signature is on documents from that period that don't hold up well under scrutiny. I've kept that file quiet because I didn't think it served anyone to drag you through it. But if this notebook starts a legal fight, that file becomes relevant again. To everyone. To the trustee, to the creditors, possibly to people with badges. I didn't know what I was signing," she said, and hated how small her voice sounded saying it. "I know that," he said, gentle in the specific way that made her skin crawl. "I believe that completely. But belief isn't evidence, and a courtroom isn't interested in what either of us believes. I'm offering you a clean way out of this. A settlement. Enough to get back on your feet, quietly, no further exposure to that file, no risk to your name. All I need is the notebook, and your agreement not to pursue any further claim." "How much?" she asked, because some part of her, exhausted and frightened, needed to know the shape of what he was offering before she could refuse it. $20,000, he said, and she almost laughed, because $20,000 against a foundational patent that, if the dates held up, predated the company by 19 years and would mean the entire IP transfer in the bankruptcy had been built on a false premise, was not an offer. It was an insult, wearing the costume of generosity, and she understood, hearing the number. Exactly how frightened Desmond Pierce actually was underneath the smooth, concerned voice, because men who were not frightened did not lowball this badly. They simply took what they wanted and let the lawyers clean up afterward. "I need to think about it," she said, because she needed time more than she needed to be brave in that exact moment, and he gave her 10 days, framed as patience. Framed as him going out on a limb for her against creditors who wanted this resolved faster. And she hung up the phone and stood in the back room of the coffee shop, with her hands shaking, in a way that had nothing to do with the tremor she'd developed, and everything to do with the particular fear of a person who has just been threatened by someone smiling the entire time he did. She did not go home after that call, because home was a motel room with thin walls and a parking lot view, and instead she sat in the back room of the coffee shop for an hour after closing, the lights off except for the one over the prep sink, turning the conversation over until the shape of it finally settled into something she could name. Aisha found her there when she came back for her forgotten keys, and did not ask what was wrong so much as simply sit down across from her and wait. The particular patient silence of a woman who had run a small business through enough crises of her own to recognize the posture of someone deciding whether a fight was worth having. "He offered me $20,000, Catherine said finally, for something that might be worth considerably more than that, and a threat dressed up as concern if I don't take it." Aisha was quiet for a moment, turning a coffee stirrer over in her fingers. "You know what $20,000 means," she said. "It means he's scared of what it's actually worth. Nobody lowballs that hard out of confidence." "I know," Catherine said. "I just don't know if I have the strength left to find out how scared." "You don't have to have the strength tonight," Aisha said. "You just have to not sign anything tonight. That's the whole job for right now." She told Caleb that evening, sitting across from him at the small kitchen table in his Lawrenceville house after Junie had gone to bed. The notebook between them, like a held breath. He listened without interrupting, the way he listened to most things, and when she finished he was quiet for a moment in a way she had learned to recognize as him actually thinking, rather than reaching for whatever came easiest. "He's scared," Caleb said finally. $20,000 isn't an offer from someone who thinks he's safe." "I know," she said. "That's what frightens me. A scared man with that much to lose isn't going to stop at one phone call." He didn't. 3 days later, the cease and desist letter arrived at Caleb's shop, hand-delivered by a process server who'd clearly enjoyed the small theater of it, claiming the safe and its contents had been improperly classified as personal property at auction when they should have been processed as corporate chattel under the bankruptcy estate, demanding immediate return of all materials, threatening a conversion lawsuit and criminal referral for theft of company property. Caleb read it twice at his workbench with his hands very still, and then he called the attorney he'd been quietly consulting, a patent specialist named Imani Castillo, who'd been a regular customer of the shop for 6 years and had agreed, mostly out of professional curiosity and a healthy distrust of anyone named Desmond Pierce, to look at the dates in the notebook for free. "It's a bluff," Imani told him over the phone that night, "but it's an expensive bluff to call." The auction house processed it correctly. Personal effects from a residential storage unit aren't corporate chattel just because a trustee's inventory team got sloppy. But proving that means depositions, possibly litigation, and if Pierce's lawyers want to make this miserable for you specifically, they can make your life very difficult while the underlying claim sorts itself out. "What does difficult look like?" Caleb asked, and found out 4 days later when his landlord, a man he'd had a cordial decade-long relationship with, called to say he'd received an inquiry from an attorney representing a creditor with questions about the legality of Caleb's lease, vague enough to mean nothing, and specific enough to make the landlord nervous, the kind of pressure that did not need to succeed to do damage, because it succeeded simply by existing, by making a man who had never once been late on rent suddenly aware that someone with resources was looking for a lever. 2 days after that, a security contractor Caleb had done annual work for, a steady, reliable client worth nearly a fifth of his shop's income, called to cancel the renewal, citing budget cuts in a voice that didn't sound like budget cuts at all. Desmond came to the coffee shop himself on the 7th day. The one detail Catherine had not anticipated, despite knowing, on some level, that a man losing control of a situation eventually stops trusting phone calls and letters to do the work for him. He came in during the slow hour after the lunch rush, dressed the way he always dressed, the kind of careful, expensive understatement that had once made boardrooms relax around him. And he sat down at the small corner table without ordering anything, and Catherine watched him from behind the counter with her hands gone very still. You can't keep avoiding this conversation, he said when she came over, his voice pitched low enough that the two customers near the window would not overhear. I came in person because I wanted you to see my face when I tell you this is the best offer you're going to get. I have customers, she said. Take 5 minutes, he said, for old time's sake. She did not sit down. She stood beside the table with her arms crossed, the particular stance of someone who had decided the conversation would happen on her terms or not at all. And Desmond, reading the posture correctly, did not press her to sit either. I've raised it to 60, he said. That's not a number I can move past without board exposure I genuinely cannot afford right now. And I need you to understand, Catherine, that I am not your enemy in this. I built that financing structure under enormous pressure to keep 400 jobs alive through a quarter that should have killed the company outright. I made decisions I'm not proud of, but I have spent 8 months trying to contain the damage from those decisions in a way that protects both of us, and a public hearing over a dead man's notebook does not protect either of us. It exposes both of us. It protects you, she said. I'm not the one with a fraud referral hanging over my head. Neither am I, he said, a flicker of something sharper moving under the careful voice for the first time since he'd sat down. Not yet, and I would like to keep it that way, which is precisely why I am standing in a coffee shop, trying to reason with you, instead of letting my attorneys handle this the way attorneys usually handle things. Is that a threat? She asked. It's an honest accounting of where we both stand, he said, and stood, smoothing his jacket with the particular composed gesture of a man trying to reclaim the upper hand on his way out the door. 10 days, Catherine, the offer expires with the deadline. After that, I can't promise what either of our lawyers do next. He left without buying anything. Catherine stood at the window and watched his car pull out of the lot, and Aisha, who had been quietly restocking cups within earshot of the entire exchange, came to stand beside her and said only, "That man has never once in his life walked into a room he wasn't trying to control. Don't let the fact that he's scared make you forget that. He didn't tell Catherine about the landlord call or the lost contract for 3 days, not out of secrecy, but out of the specific male instinct to absorb a hit quietly while he figured out how bad it actually was. And when she found out, from Junie of all people, who mentioned offhand that Dad had been on the phone a lot and using his serious voice, Catherine sat him down at the kitchen table with the particular controlled fury of someone who had watched this exact playbook be run on other people before and recognized every move. This is what he does, she said. He doesn't come at you directly. He finds the load-bearing parts of your life and leans on them until you decide the fight isn't worth it. I'm not walking away from this, Caleb said. You might have to think about it, she said, quieter than she meant to. You have a daughter and a lease and a business that's barely holding on as it is, and none of this is your fight. It's mine. I won't be the reason you lose what you've built to protect Junie. He looked at her across the table for a long moment, the kind of look that asked a question he had not yet found a way to ask out loud. And then he said, with the flat certainty of a man stating a fact rather than making an argument, "You didn't ask me to fight for this. I decided to." There's a difference, and Desmond called once more, 6 days into the 10 he had given her, and this time he did not bother with the careful, concerned voice from the first call. He sounded tired, the particular tired of a man watching a structure he had spent years reinforcing begin to show cracks he could not patch fast enough. I raised the offer, he said without greeting. 60,000. That's everything I can move without the board noticing, and I'm doing it because I still think I'm protecting you from something you don't fully understand. If this goes to a hearing, your name gets dragged through every signature on that financing package, whether or not you knew what you were signing. I built a wall around that file for 8 months, Catherine. I'm trying to keep it standing. You built a wall around it for yourself, she said, not for me. If it were really about protecting me, you would have told me what was in those documents the day I signed them, instead of letting me find out from a bankruptcy filing. There was a silence on the line long enough that she almost thought the call had dropped. Maybe both things are true, he said finally, quieter than she had ever heard him. I don't expect you to believe that. I'm not sure I fully believe it myself anymore. But I am telling you, as plainly as I know how, that once this goes in front of a judge, I lose the ability to control what happens to either of us. I would rather you take the 60,000 and walk away clean. I don't want clean, she said. I want true. There's a difference, and I spent 8 months learning it the hard way. He did not call again after that. Caleb, listening from across the kitchen table while she relayed the conversation afterward, said only, "He's not protecting you. He's protecting the version of himself that gets to keep believing he never meant any harm. That's not the same thing, even when it sounds like it from the inside, and the difference matters to me more than the least does." She did not have an answer for that. She sat with it instead, the way she had learned, over the worst months of her life, to sit with things that did not resolve easily. And it was in that silence, 2 days later, sitting on his back porch with the notebook open between them while Junie chased fireflies in the small fenced yard, that she finally told him the rest of it, the part she had not told anyone. Not Amani, not Aisha, not the version of herself that gave careful guarded answers to careful guarded questions. "My father died of a dosing error," she said flat. The words coming out the way Caleb had noticed she spoke about anything that actually cost her something, stripped of the performance she used for everything else. He couldn't afford the equipment that would have made it safe. "I built the company to fix that. And I spent 7 years telling everyone, including myself, that I'd solved the core problem he never lived to solve." That page in the notebook, the valve refinement, dated 19 years before I supposedly invented it independently. I didn't solve his problem. He already had. I just didn't know it, because I never really looked at his work closely enough to see it. Because looking at it too closely meant admitting how much I missed him, and it was easier to be the genius who fixed what he couldn't than to be the daughter who didn't pay close enough attention while he was alive to notice he already had. Caleb did not offer her comfort for that, did not rush to tell her it wasn't her fault, because he had learned, in 3 years of his own grief, that the rush to comfort someone out of a true and painful thing usually said more about the comforter's discomfort than the comforted person's needs. He sat with it instead, let it occupy the space between them, and after a while he said, quietly, "My wife died of an aneurysm. No warning, nothing anyone could have caught, gone in under an hour from completely fine to gone. I spent the first year furious that there was nothing to fix, no equipment, no decision, nothing I could have done differently. Because at least your grief has an object. Mine just has an absence. I think I understand, a little, why finding something with your father's handwriting in it matters more than the legal fight. It's not really about the patent." "No," she said. "It's not. Sal used to tell me something," Caleb said after a while, the words coming slower than usual, like he was deciding how much of it to share even as he said it. He said a lock doesn't fail because it's weak. It fails because somebody finally took the time to understand it properly. I used to think that was just a thing he said about tumblers and wheels. I think now he meant it about people too. Nobody's ever actually unbreakable. They're just waiting for someone patient enough to understand the mechanism." "Is that what you think you're doing?" she asked with me. "Understanding the mechanism. I think I stopped thinking of it that way a while back," he said. "Somewhere around the second Saturday Junie made you steam milk for her hot chocolate, and you let her, even though you clearly had no idea what you were doing with that machine. I stopped seeing a mechanism. I just saw you." They sat there a long while after that, the fireflies rising in the dark yard, Junie's laughter drifting in from somewhere near the fence line, and neither of them said anything else, because some things once said honestly did not need to be followed by more words to matter. Junie had been tracing the schematics for 2 weeks, before either adult noticed what she was doing. She had found the notebook on the kitchen table on a Sunday afternoon when both of them were occupied with the kind of low-grade adult tension that fills a room without anyone raising their voice, and she had opened it the way she opened everything, with total unself-conscious curiosity, and found pages of careful drawn lines that looked, to her 7-year-old eyes, like a treasure map for something mechanical. She did not understand what a microdosing valve was. She understood that the lines were beautiful in the specific way that precise things are beautiful, and she began copying them into her own sketchbook in the back corner of the coffee shop on Saturdays, adding small details of her own, a sun in one corner, a tiny bird perched on what Catherine would later recognize as the housing assembly, because Junie had decided, without consulting anyone, that the drawings needed something alive in them. Catherine found the sketchbook by accident, flipping through it to find a blank page for a grocery list while Junie was in the bathroom. And she sat very still at the kitchen table, looking at a 7-year-old's careful, imperfect, deeply loving copy of her father's most important work. A bird perched on a valve housing like it belonged there, and she had to leave the room for a few minutes before she trusted her voice again. "You can keep tracing them," she told Junie later, "if you want." He would have liked that someone was paying attention to the lines. "Was he a good drawer?" Junie asked. "The best," Catherine said. "Better than me." "Are you sad about him?" Junie asked, with the specific, unguarded directness that made adults flinch and made Catherine increasingly grateful, because nobody else in her life asked her things so plainly anymore. Everyone else managed her with careful, sympathetic distance, the particular tiptoeing people do around a woman who has lost a company and a father and a future, all in the same calendar year, and Junie simply asked the question and waited for the actual answer. "Every day," Catherine said. "But it's a different kind of sad now. It used to be sharp. Now it's more like carrying something heavy that's gotten easier to hold, not because it's lighter, but because I've gotten stronger." Junie considered this with the seriousness she brought to everything. "That's what Dad says about Mom," she said. "He says you don't stop carrying it, you just get muscles for it." Catherine had started staying for dinner most evenings by then. An arrangement that had never been formally proposed so much as accumulated, one extra place set at the table, becoming 2 extra evenings a week becoming, by the start of the 3rd month, something close to a habit nobody questioned out loud. She brought groceries some nights. The specific small contribution of someone trying to find a way to participate in a household without overstepping a line she could not entirely see, and Caleb had stopped pretending he didn't notice when she did it, had started instead simply thanking her and moving the conversation forward, which she had come to understand was his particular way of accepting things gracefully without making a production of the acceptance. There was an evening in late winter when Junie, halfway through a bowl of spaghetti, asked Catherine to help her with a school project about family trees, and Catherine had frozen for half a second before agreeing. Because the assignment required drawing branches for parents and grandparents, and Catherine did not know, in that moment, what she was supposed to be in the diagram. A question Junie herself answered without being asked, drawing a small branch off to the side, labeled simply Catherine, connected to nothing and everything at once. The particular unbothered logic of a child who did not need a category to exist before she could draw it. Caleb watched the two of them bent over the construction paper at the kitchen table, his daughter's careful handwriting, Catherine's quiet, patient corrections to the spelling, and felt something settle in his chest that he had not let himself feel fully since Elise died. The specific, dangerous warmth of believing, again, that a good thing might be allowed to last. It was Junie, 3 weeks later, who finally said the thing both adults had been circling for months without naming. On an ordinary Tuesday evening at the kitchen table, while Catherine helped her with a math worksheet and Caleb made dinner at the stove, the radio playing low. Junie set down her pencil and looked between them with the assessing patience of someone who had been gathering evidence and had reached a conclusion. "You don't need the company back," she said to Catherine. "You need people who didn't leave." The kitchen went very quiet. Caleb's hand stilled on the spatula. Catherine looked at the worksheet in front of her, at the rows of half-finished multiplication problems, and found that she could not immediately speak. "What makes you say that?" she managed finally. "Because you keep saying you want the patent back so you can fix what the bad man did," Junie said, with the matter-of-fact logic of a child who had clearly thought about this for some time. "But you already have the notebook. You already have the bird drawings. You already have us. I don't think the patent is the thing you're actually sad about not having." Catherine did not have an answer for that, not one she trusted herself to say out loud without her voice breaking, and Caleb, watching from the stove, saw something shift across her face that he recognized, because he had felt it himself. Months earlier, standing in a parking lot, working up the nerve to knock on a motel door, the specific vertigo of being told a true thing by someone too young to know it was supposed to be complicated. That night, after Junie was asleep, Catherine and Caleb sat on the back porch again, the way they had taken to doing most nights by then, and she said, "Without preamble, I think we should build something. Not to get the company back. Something new." "What kind of something?" he asked. "A device shop," she said. "Small, honest, built around what's actually in that notebook, not the version Desmond turned into a thing he could leverage and sell. You have the precision background. You have the patience for exact work. I have the engineering and the manufacturing relationships, what's left of them, and a design that's mine free and clear if Amani's case holds up. We build it together, slow, in the back of your shop if you'll let us use the space, and we keep the price low the way my father would have wanted it, the way I built the original company to want it before it got away from me. That's a big ask, Caleb said. But he was already looking around the kitchen the way a man looks at a space he's reconsidering the use of, already doing the math in his head about the back storage room he barely used. What do we call it? He asked, which she understood, hearing the question, was not really a question about a name. It was him saying yes. She thought about it for several days before she landed on it, turning over names that felt either too corporate or too precious, until she settled on something simple enough to hold what it actually meant. Renan Hartley, she said to him one evening, testing the words out loud for the first time. Not because it sounds impressive, because it's true. It's what we both put into it. He liked it more than he expected to, the particular weight of seeing his own name set down next to a dead man's, next to the only two people who'd ever asked nothing of him in return for showing up. They built it in the back of the locksmith shop through the spring, evenings and weekends, Imani working the legal case during the day, while Catherine and Caleb worked the actual device at night. The two of them developing a working rhythm neither had expected, her precision in the design specifications meeting his precision in the physical tolerances, the way two people who each understood exactness in their own discipline could recognize it instantly in someone else's. Junie was there most evenings too, doing homework at a corner table or adding small drawings to the whiteboard where they sketched out manufacturing steps, a bird in the margin of every major diagram, a tradition nobody had decided on out loud but nobody questioned either. There were costly weeks. The initial tooling order came back from the machine shop with a critical dimension off by 0.5 millimeter. A mistake that cost them $300 they did not have to spare, and 2 weeks of delay while a corrected batch was cut. And Caleb absorbed the loss the way he absorbed most things, quietly, working an extra weekend of locksmith jobs to cover the gap rather than mention it until. Catherine noticed the strain in his face and made him tell her. There were costly weeks. The initial tooling order came back from the machine shop with a critical dimension off by 0.5 millimeter. A mistake that cost them $300 they did not have to spare, and 2 weeks of delay while a corrected batch was cut, and Caleb absorbed the loss the way he absorbed most things. Quietly, working an extra weekend of locksmith jobs to cover the gap, rather than mention it until Catherine noticed the strain in his face and made him tell her. You can't keep doing that, she said, standing in the doorway of the back room with her arms crossed, watching him recheck a tolerance gauge for the third time that evening. Absorbing things alone. That's not how a partnership works. It's how I've done everything for 3 years, he said, not looking up from the gauge. I know, she said. I'm not asking you to stop being someone who shows up. I'm asking you to let me show up too. We split the loss. Half from the device fund, half from what's left of mine. What's left of yours is nothing, he said. And she shrugged. The particular dry shrug of someone who had already done the math on having nothing and found it less frightening than she'd expected. Then we split nothing in half, she said. It still counts. He let her cover it after that, and the small concession marked something neither of them named directly, the moment a partnership stopped being one person's generosity toward another and became, instead, two people genuinely building the same thing from the same ground. The manufacturing relationships were harder to rebuild than either of them expected. Catherine reached out to 3 contacts from her former life in the first month, suppliers and partners who had worked closely with her for years, and 2 of them did not return her calls at all. The particular silence of people who had decided, sometime during the bankruptcy proceedings, that associating with her name carried more risk than the relationship was worth. The third, a small regional fabricator named Owen Castellano, who had handled the company's earliest prototype runs back when the whole operation still fit in a single warehouse bay, called her back within the hour and told her, with no hesitation she could detect, that he'd assumed something had gone wrong with Desmond Pierce, rather than with her, because he'd never once, in 5 years of working together, seen her cut a corner that compromised the device's safety, and that kind of memory mattered more to him than whatever the bankruptcy filing said. "I'm not running a company this time," she told him. "Not yet. Just a prototype, built honest, see if it holds up." "Send me the specs," Owen said. "I'll quote it at cost. Consider it a deposit on whatever this turns into." The closer they got to a working prototype, the more the project began to feel, to both of them, like something with real stakes attached rather than a private act of grief made physical. And the closer it got to mattering that way, the more it scared them when it nearly fell apart. Owen called on a Tuesday in late March to say that the regulatory pathway for a medical dosing device, even a simplified one, required testing documentation neither of them had budgeted for. A $6,000 gap that sat between the prototype they had and the prototype they could legally bring to a manufacturing partner. And Caleb had sat at the workbench that night, running numbers that did not work, no matter how many times he rearranged them. "We could license the design and let someone else handle the regulatory side," Catherine said, not because she wanted to, but because she had learned, the hard way, to say the practical thing out loud before letting herself want the harder thing instead. "That's not why we built it in the back room," Caleb said. "I know," she said. "I'm just telling you what's actually possible with the money we have." "Then we find $6,000, he said, with the flat stubbornness she had come to recognize as the thing underneath everything else he did, the same stubbornness that had kept him working a dead safe for 3 weeks on a $50 gamble. He took on extra locksmith jobs that month, weekend emergency calls he would normally have turned away, and Catherine picked up a second shift at the coffee shop, and between the two of them and a small advance Imani arranged against the eventual settlement, the gap closed by the second week of April, narrower than either of them would have liked, but closed. And Caleb had looked at the bank statement that finally balanced, and said, quietly, "Not a triumph, just a fact. We did the thing that looked impossible 3 weeks ago." There was a night in April when Junie had a fever that frightened them both more than the actual illness warranted, the specific outsized terror of two people who had each already lost someone without warning. And they sat up together in the hospital waiting room until 2 a.m., with a chart that turned out to say nothing more dramatic than a common virus, and walked out into the parking lot afterward not saying much, just standing close in the cold the way people stand who have just discovered, together, how much they had to lose. What they were to each other had not been formally named by then, not out loud, though it had been obvious for months to anyone watching, to Junie especially, who had taken to introducing Catherine to her teacher as my dad's person, without being asked to clarify what that meant. It was Caleb who finally said it plainly. On a Sunday afternoon in May, with the prototype housing finally machined correctly and sitting on the workbench between them like a small, quiet victory, both of them tired and proud and standing slightly closer than the work required. "I don't know what this is officially," he said, "but I know what it is to me. You're not someone I'm helping out of an obligation. And you're not someone Junie just happens to like. You're the person I want at this table every night, working or not working, whether the patent comes back or doesn't. I should have said that a while ago." Catherine looked at him for a long moment, at the careful, steady, unhurried man who had bought a dead stranger's safe for $50 and refused to let it become a transaction, and she said, with the plain certainty of someone who had finally stopped bracing for the catch, "I want that too. I've wanted it for a while. I just didn't trust myself to want anything that wasn't already broken." "It's not broken," he said. "No," she said. "It's not." Junie asked, one evening that same week, while the prototype housing sat cooling on the bench, whether Catherine's dad and her own mom knew each other now, wherever people went, and Catherine had knelt down to her level instead of answering from standing, the particular respect she had learned over months of Saturdays that this child's questions deserved. "I don't know for certain," Catherine said, "but I like to think they'd get along. Your mom sounds like she didn't put up with nonsense, and neither did my dad. That's usually enough to make two people friends." "Do you think they'd be happy about this?" Junie asked, gesturing at the workbench, the drawings on the wall, her father across the room measuring a housing tolerance, with the same careful attention he brought to everything. "Yeah," Catherine said, and found she believed it completely. "I think they'd be very happy about this." What neither of them knew yet, standing in that small back room with sawdust on the floor and a prototype housing between them, was that Imani's case had reached its final stage that same week, a hearing scheduled for the following Thursday that would determine, in a courtroom neither of them had ever expected to need, whether Thomas Wren's original work belonged, finally and irrevocably, to the one person who had never stopped believing it was hers to begin with. The hearing took place on a Thursday morning in a courtroom that looked nothing like the conference rooms where Catherine had spent most of her professional life. Smaller and plainer and somehow more honest for it. No glass walls, no skyline view, just wood paneling and a judge who had clearly read every page of the filing before either side said a word out loud. Imani had built the case methodically over 8 weeks, the dated schematics cross, referenced against archival records from the regional engineering competition where Thomas Wren had won his medal. A handwriting analysis comparing the notebook entries to tax documents and old correspondence that placed every relevant page firmly in the years before the company's founding. A paper trail so thorough that Desmond Pierce's attorney spent most of the hearing trying to argue procedure rather than substance. The specific sound of a legal team that knew the underlying facts were no longer in their favor. Imani walked the judge through the timeline with the unhurried precision of someone who had built the case to survive exactly this kind of scrutiny. The regional engineering competition records establishing the medal's date. The archival tax filings placing the notebook's earliest dated pages a full 19 years before the company's incorporation. A handwriting expert's brief but unambiguous testimony confirming every relevant page belonged to the same author across 3 decades of entries. Catherine had braced herself for the experience to feel vindicating in some loud, satisfying way, and instead found it almost unbearably quiet. The specific hush of a courtroom listening to a dead man's careful handwriting get read back into a public record is proof that he had mattered exactly as much as his daughter had always believed. Desmond did not attend in person. He sent a junior attorney to deliver an argument about laches and timely filing that the judge dismantled in under 10 minutes, and Catherine, sitting beside Imani at the plaintiff's table with Caleb in the row behind her, understood, watching it happen, that the absence itself was its own kind of answer. A man who believed he could win does not send a junior associate to argue it for him. The ruling came 2 weeks later, delivered in the dry procedural language courts, used for decisions that nonetheless changed the entire shape of someone's life. The foundational patent, originally developed and documented by Thomas Wren prior to the establishment of the company that would later bear elements of his work, was determined never to have been a corporate asset, and therefore had never legally transferred as part of the bankruptcy estate. Ownership reverted, in full, to his sole heir. The holding company Desmond Pierce controlled was ordered to cease any further use or licensing of the foundational design, and the broader question of the fraudulent representations in the original financing documents was. The judge noted in a line that would prove far more consequential to Desmond Pierce than anything involving the patent itself, being referred for separate review. Catherine read the ruling twice in the courthouse hallway, standing beside Caleb in the cold fluorescent light, and found that the moment did not feel the way she had imagined it would for the 8 months she had been waiting for it. There was no triumph in it, no satisfaction in picturing Desmond Pierce's face when he read the same document. There was only a quiet, settling rightness, the specific feeling of a weight finally set down in the correct place after months of carrying it in the wrong one. "It's yours," Imani said. "All of it. Free and clear." Catherine looked at the ruling, then at Caleb, then down the hallway where Junie sat on a bench, swinging her feet, waiting for them with the patient boredom of a child who had been promised ice cream regardless of how the meeting went. "It's not just mine," Catherine said. The licensing deal came together faster than any of them expected. An ethical manufacturing partnership with a regional medical equipment cooperative that had spent years looking for exactly the kind of low-cost, high-precision device Wren and Hartley had built in the back of a locksmith shop on Butler Street, a deal structured, at Catherine's specific insistence, with price caps written permanently into the contract. The same caps her father's death had made non-negotiable to her 17 years earlier. The announcement ran as a small item in the same regional business journal that had once profiled her at the peak of the first company. A few paragraphs, no fanfare, a photograph of Catherine and Caleb standing in front of the shop with Junie between them holding a drawing of the device housing with a bird perched on top of it that the manufacturing partner had, without anyone asking, decided to use as the actual product logo. Desmond Pierce did not call again. Word reached them eventually, through Amani's contacts in the patent bar, that the fraud referral had grown teeth. That creditors who had been quietly suspicious of his financing structure for over a year were no longer being quiet about it. That the man who had once smiled his way through every difficult conversation was now, by all accounts, having a great many difficult conversations he could not smile his way out of. Nobody in Wren and Hartley's back room celebrated it. There was nothing to gloat over. He had simply, finally, lost the thing he had spent so long trying to protect, and the losing required no further commentary from any of them. They held the prototype's first full demonstration on a Saturday in June, in the small back room that had grown, over 4 months, from a storage space into something close to a real workshop, and they invited the people who had actually mattered through the worst of it. Aisha came from the coffee shop. Imani came still wearing her work clothes from a deposition that had run long. Marion sat in a folding chair near the door with the specific quiet pride of a woman watching her granddaughter's father build something good out of something broken. Junie ran the demonstration herself, mostly narrating the valve mechanism to anyone who would listen with the confident authority of a 7-year-old who had spent 4 months tracing the design and had decided, somewhere along the way, that this made her an expert. Late that evening, after the last guest had gone and Junie had fallen asleep on the workshop's old couch with the drawing still clutched in one hand, Catherine and Caleb stood together at the workbench, looking at the finished prototype under the work lamp, the same kind of light he had used the night the safe first gave up its secret. "We did it," she said, the words landing differently than she'd expected. No triumph in them, just a quiet, settled fact. "We're doing it," he said. "Past tense feels too finished. I'd like this to keep going for a while." She looked at him, at the steady, unhurried man who had never once asked her to be anything other than exactly what she already was, and found that the warmth in her chest no longer felt dangerous the way new things once had. "So would I," she said. Catherine kept the old safe in the corner of the workshop, its door no longer bolted shut, propped permanently open, the dented gray steel repainted but otherwise unaltered, sitting beside the workbench like a deliberate piece of furniture rather than the dead weight it had once been mistaken for. The notebook sat open on top of it. Displayed under a small sheet of glass Caleb had cut and fitted himself, open to the page with the valve refinement, her father's careful handwriting visible to anyone who walked in, the black and white photograph propped beside it, the man and the laughing girl in a workshop that no longer existed anywhere except in this one. There is a version of this story that gets told as a lucky find, the $50 gamble that paid off, the kind of headline that makes people scroll past it thinking about what they might find at their own local auction next weekend. That version is not wrong, exactly, but it misses the actual mechanism of what happened, which had very little to do with luck, and a great deal to do with a single decision made at a workbench at midnight. The decision not to sell what was easy to sell, simply because the paperwork said he was allowed to. What Catherine lost was never really the company. Companies dissolve and reform under new names every day, and the world does not stop to mourn them. What she lost, and what she spent 8 months learning how to actually grieve instead of simply outrun, was the belief that she had solved her father's unfinished problem on her own. A belief that had let her carry his death as a debt fully repaid rather than what it actually was. A wound still open, still waiting for someone to look closely enough to see what was actually there underneath it. What Caleb found was not a patent. He has said more than once, sitting at that same workbench with Junie's drawings taped along the wall above it, that he did not buy a safe that night. He bought a question he could not put down, the same kind of question that had made him good at his work for 15 years, and the answer turned out to be a family he had not known he was looking for. Built not out of rescue or obligation, but out of the simple, repeated, unglamorous choice to keep showing up for people who had nothing left to offer him in return. There is a particular kind of value that does not show up on a balance sheet, the kind that survives bankruptcy court and liquidation auctions and a room full of strangers deciding, in under a minute, that something is worth $50 or nothing at all. It is the value of a thing nobody else thought to look closely enough at. And it is, more often than people expect, the value of a person too. The world is full of safes nobody wants to crack, because the work looks unprofitable from the outside. full of people written off as liabilities because somebody with a clipboard decided, on a bad day, that they no longer carried enough resale value to bother with. Catherine Wren learned, the hard way, that the people who actually matter are not the ones who show up when you are worth something. They are the ones who show up at a motel door with a towel-wrapped bundle and ask for nothing in return, who keep working at a problem long after it stops being convenient, who refuse, simply and quietly, to throw away what everyone else has already decided is worthless. The safe still sits in the corner of the workshop, door open, paint repainted, the dial worn smooth from a hand that is no longer here to turn it. Nobody locks it anymore. There is nothing left in it to protect, because everything that mattered already found its way out, into a notebook, into a child's careful drawings, into a small back room on Butler Street, where a bird perched on a valve housing has become, against every reasonable expectation, the symbol of something built to last.